Welcome back. This next video addresses personal jurisdiction in federal court. Now first it's important to note that jurisdiction in federal court is generally covered by the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, whereas in state court it's limited by the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. As we're going to see very shortly, that means that the possibility of PJ in federal court can be much broader than it is in state court. The reason is that personal jurisdiction is territorial. So the sovereign for state court is the territory of the state, such as the state of Florida, whereas for personal jurisdiction in federal court, we look to the territory of the entire United States. Okay? Of course, there are due process clauses in both the Fifth and the 14th amendments, but because the Fifth Amendment is limiting the power of the federal government, and the federal government is itself the territory of the United States, that means jurisdiction in a federal court can be much broader. Now, what I'm going to do here is move into Rule 4K and Rule 4N here of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Now, Rule 4N deals with jurisdiction over property, and Rule 4K deals with jurisdiction over persons, both in federal court. Equally so, I want to pull up the coggle and go to that part of the coggle. You'll note the left-hand part of the coggle deals with federal court. So what you should be doing is either having your coggle open, best have your coggle open as well as your statute books open to Rule 4N. So if you're in federal court, under 4N1, if you're in federal court, you can have jurisdiction over property if a federal statute authorizes it. Under Rule 4N2, you can have jurisdiction over property as well, but only if in personam jurisdiction is unavailable. If that's the case, then you can use an applicable state law to garnish, seize, or otherwise control assets in order to assert jurisdiction over property. So think of 4N2 as being kind of a long-arm statute dealing with property located within the jurisdiction. Now, regarding persons, we have Rule 4K. And Rule 4K has a number of bases. I'm going to start off with Rule 4K1A. The basic gist of 4K1A is to analyze personal jurisdiction the same way it would be analyzed in the corresponding state court. So if we're in a Florida federal court, analyze the same way it would be in a Florida state court, which means two things. Number one, use the Florida long-arm statute, the long-arm statute of the state in which the federal court sits. Second, analyze using 14th Amendment due process. And you might think, Professor, you just said that in federal court we use the Fifth Amendment. And that's true. But what's special about 4K1A is it tells the federal court to analyze PJ the same way a state court of general subject matter jurisdiction would analyze it. So if the federal court needs to do what the state court does, well, the state court uses the state long arm plus 14th Amendment due process. The result of that is that most assertions of personal jurisdiction in federal court will be analyzed under Rule 4K1A and should reflect the same analysis and result as would have been done in the corresponding state court. However, because the Fifth Amendment allows bases for jurisdiction that aren't possible in state court, we have 4K1B, 4K1C, and 4K2. 4K1B is the Bulge Rule. The Bulge Rule has three requirements. First, the defendant who's being brought in other words, the defendant against whom PJ is being asserted, must have been brought in under Rule 14 or 19. Let's see if I can get a little pen here so I can write. There we go. So you have P versus D, and then the defendant brings in a third-party defendant. Okay. Well, this third-party defendant here is brought in pursuant to Rule 14 for reasons we discussed, such as in the Asahi case. All right. If you have somebody that's being brought in under Rule 14, check, and they're served within 100 miles where the summons is issued, and they're served in a federal judicial district, then we have what's called Bulge Jurisdiction. And an example that we talked about this in our civil procedure class lawsuit filed in Tallahassee and the Northern District of Florida. Let's say the third-party defendant is a repair shop in Florida, and the repair shop is within 100 miles of the Tallahassee federal court. We'll say the victim, plaintiff, sues the driver, and then the driver brings in the repair shop, okay, and the repair shop's located in Georgia. Well, assuming there's no contacts that the repair shop has in Florida, you wouldn't be able to use 4K1A because there's no minimum contacts. However, under the Bulge rule, so long as the repair shop is served in a federal judicial district, here's a district in Georgia, and that service is within 100 miles of the place where the summons was issued, that's the federal courthouse in Tallahassee, and the defendant is joined under Rule 19 or 14, here it's Rule 14, then there's going to be personal jurisdiction. This is available in federal court, but not in state court. Moving back to the Coggle, there's other bases as well, such as, here we go, such as 4K1C, which says there's PJ when a specialized federal statute permits PJ, okay? That would be, for example, under federal interpleader. We're not going to get that discussed further in this semester. We'll talk about that in the spring. However, we also have the federal long-arm statute. Get some space back. There we go. Federal long-arm statute, which applies very rarely. There we go. And requires three things. First, the claim has to arise under federal law. So it can't be a state contract claim, can't be a state negligence claim. It's got to be something asserted under federal law, say copyright law, patent law, federal discrimination, and so on. Second, there can't be 4K1A jurisdiction in any state court. Put differently, there can be no state court of general jurisdiction that would have PJ. That means no jurisdiction in any state. Okay, well, if we have a federal question and no state court jurisdiction, then PJ is okay so long as personal jurisdiction will be consistent with the Constitution. In other words, the defendant has sufficient minimum contacts. But the contacts here are not with the state, they're with the USA as a whole, because as we said, in federal court we're governed by the Fifth Amendment, and here the sovereign and the territory is the entire United States. And that's our discussion of the federal long-arm statute. Don't stop yet. What I'll note here is that under 4KN, we talked about property, right? At 4K1A, we talked about state court jurisdiction, right? But 4KN2 says use state law for assertions of jurisdiction over property. 4K1A says analyze as how a state court would. So the other parts of this video are going to be talking about state court personal jurisdiction. But keep in mind that the analyses that I'm going to talk about in these parts of the video apply to federal court as well because of the operation of 4N2 over property and 4K1A regarding in personam jurisdiction over persons. Thank you.